In a quiet Yorkshire village, archaeologists uncovered skeletons that had been mutilated to stop the dead from rising, with heads severed, chests torn open, and limbs broken and burned. Why were the people in medieval England so afraid of their own dead? Let's find out. And by the end, we'll see that this wasn't just a single strange burial, but a wider reaction to horrific events that haunted medieval Britain. If you enjoy uncovering history's darker mysteries and the supernatural, remember to like and subscribe for more episodes just like this. In the 12th century, Alnwick Castle wasn't the tourist landmark it is today. It was a hard border fortress in Northumberland, perched between two warring kingdoms, battered by Scottish raids, famine, and unrest. Fear and violence were part of daily life, and its lord had a reputation for cruelty that lingered long after his death. Because according to chronicler William of Newburgh, death didn't stop him at all. Soon after his burial, villagers began whispering that he'd returned. At night, doors rattled, livestock panicked, and strange illnesses spread through the town. Families said they saw a shadow prowling the streets, and always the same figure, their dead lord, restless in the grave. Finally, driven by fear, a mob exhumed him. What they found chilled them to the bone. Instead of a withered corpse, his body was grotesquely bloated, his face ruddy and swollen, his shroud stained with blood. His veins, they said, were still full of blood, as if he'd been feeding on the living. To medieval eyes, this wasn't just natural decay, it was proof of vampirism. Their solution was swift and brutal. They dragged his corpse beyond the town walls, hacked it apart, burned the remains until nothing left. Only then did the terror subside. For William of Newburgh, writing in the 1190s, it was one of several such accounts in England, evidence that he thought that the restless dead were a real and terrifying phenomenon. Stories like this weren't yet called vampire tales. That word wouldn't spread into English for centuries. In the Middle Ages, they were called revenants, from the French revenir, to return. And to the people of the time, that's exactly what they were, the dead who refused to stay buried. Revenants weren't elegant counts in castles. There was something much more down to earth and real, and more unsettling. They were lords who crawled back from their graves, monks splitting open blood-filled corpses by torchlight, and terrified villagers burning their own neighbours. These are England's forgotten vampires. Around the same period, another story circulated, this one from Buckinghamshire. Again, our source is William of Newburgh. If his name sounds familiar, it's because he's the same chronicler who recorded the Green Children of Woolpit, another strange event that we've explored before. But while the Woolpit tale is strange and otherworldly, his vampire accounts are pure nightmare. William describes how a man, rotten in life, refused to stay dead. After burial, he was seen wandering by night, stalking his former neighbours, striking terror into all who crossed his path. He pounded at their doors, whispered foul curses in the darkness, and left whole households sleepless with dread. Finally, the panic grew too great. The villagers sought help, and the Bishop of Lincoln himself, Hugh of Avalon, who would later be canonised as St. Hugh, was consulted. His command was chillingly practical. Dig up the body, dismember it, and burn what remained. And what do you do when even a saint commands you to take an axe to the dead? Refuse and you risk ending up on the wrong side of both the church and the vampire. When the grave was opened, William records that the corpse was swollen and full of blood, its lips darkened and veins heavy with it. To the onlookers, this was proof the man had been feeding on the living. They hacked him apart, arms, legs, torso, until the remains were unrecognisable. The pieces were thrown onto a pyre, and as the flames consumed him, the haunting ceased. What makes this case remarkable is not just the violence, but the fact that a saint of the medieval church endorsed it. For all their prayers and faith, even the holiest of men of the age sometimes turned to fire and axe to silence the dead. But in another town, the terror spread beyond one household and it threatened an entire community. If Alnwick and Buckinghamshire weren't enough, William of Newburgh gave us more. He tells of a revenant terrorising Berwick, a wealthy merchant in life, but corrupt, dishonoured, and hated. When he finally died, many thought that the town had been freed of him, but the relief didn't last long. Soon after burial, the dead man was seen again. Each night, his bloated figure stalked the streets, muttering obscenities, slamming against doors, rattling shutters. Families swore they heard his footsteps in the mud outside their homes, circling like a predator. And worse, wherever he went, sickness followed. Berwick was no sleepy hamlet either. It was one of the most important trading towns on the Anglo-Scottish border, a place where goods and people constantly moved, and where plagues spread with terrifying speed. For the townsfolk, it was easy to connect the dots. The Revenant was not only a terror, but the very source of the plague consuming their families. At last, desperate villagers dug him up. William writes that his body appeared ruddy and turgid, its veins still glistening with blood. They dragged the corpse through the street, hacked it to pieces and burned the remains until the stench of charred flesh drifted over the town. For the people of Berwick, the Revenant was more than a haunting. He was a plague bringer, a walking embodiment of the disease that stalked their homes. And if that sounds like the stuff of nightmares, the next tale is even darker because it unfolded within the cloisters of a monastery. Across the border in Melrose, another tale tells of a revenant haunting a monastery. A corpse was said to rise from its grave each night, slipping into the cloisters to attack the living. The monks tried prayers and holy water, but nothing stopped him. Fear spread through the abbey, a place where faith was supposed to conquer fear of the dead. Finally, they resorted to brutal action. By torchlight, they opened the grave and split open the body with an axe. The chronicler records a great gush of blood poured forth, as though the corpse was freshly alive. If faith and prayer couldn't stop the revenant, what protection was left, apart from apparently very sharp axes? The remains were burned, and the revenant was no more. What makes this story chilling is not just the revenant itself, but the setting. Melrose Abbey was a renowned centre of Christian scholarship, and yet when confronted with a vampire, even monks abandoned ritual and turned to the axe. It was a spiritual crisis, proof that in the medieval imagination, the dead could even defy the church. And centuries later, the fear hadn't gone away. It simply evolved into something closer to the Gothic vampire we know today. By the 18th century, England's vampire stories hadn't vanished, they'd simply changed shape. No longer confined to chronicles of plague or cloisters of monks, the tales had become something else, closer to the Gothic horror we recognise today. And nowhere is that clearer than the story of the Croglin vampire. In Cumberland, at a house called Croglin Grange, a young woman named Amelia Cranswell lived with her brothers. One summer evening, she sat by her window, watching the twilight fade. From the fields beyond, she noticed two lights, glimmering, unblinking, and moving closer. As they neared, she realised with dread they weren't lanterns, but eyes burning in the darkness. The figure crept to her window and began to scratch at the glass. Long, ragged nails screeched against the pane until, with sudden violence, it smashed its way inside. The thing seized her by the arm and sank its teeth into her flesh. She screamed as blood poured from the wound, but her brothers came running. The creature fled into the night, leaving a trail of blood on the floorboards. For weeks, the terror continued. Each night, Amelia feared it would return. Finally, her brothers took action. Armed and watchful, they kept vigil. One night, the vampire came back. They fired their pistols, striking its leg, and followed the wounded figure across the fields. Their chase led them to a crypt in the local churchyard. Inside, among the coffins, they found one lid prized open, and there lay a body, hideous, half decayed, with fresh blood still glistening on its lips. The brothers dragged it out, burned the remains, and buried the ashes. The Croglin vampire reads like a nightmare transposed into the Gothic age. Scratching claws at the window, glowing eyes in the dark, and a victim bitten in her bedchamber. By the 18th century, the vampire was evolving into a creature of horror literature, but its roots, as we've seen, lay deep in the English soil. But while stories chilled the imagination, archaeologists would eventually uncover something more tangible, hard evidence in the bones themselves. So far, we've looked at chronicles and folklore, but the most chilling evidence of England's vampire fears comes not from stories, but from the ground itself. On the edge of the Yorkshire wolds lies the ruined medieval village of Wharram Percy. Today, it's a scattering of stones and the broken shell of a church. But beneath the soil, archaeologists made a discovery that shocked them. Buried in shallow pits were dozens of human skeletons, and every one told the same grisly story. The bones had been deliberately mutilated. Many bore cut marks from sharp blades clustered around the head and neck. Some skulls showed signs of decapitation. Others had jaws smashed or ribs hacked through. Long bones were cracked open, as if deliberately broken after death. Several skeletons were scorched by fire, evidence that they'd been burned, either whole or in parts. These weren't marks of war or accident, they were systematic, a community's attempts to stop its own dead from rising. Carbon dating placed the remains between the 11th and 14th centuries, the very period when William of Newburgh was writing about revenants. Further analysis showed that these individuals weren't criminals or outsiders. They were ordinary villagers, buried and then later exhumed by their own neighbours. One body even showed signs of multiple interventions, as if someone kept returning to make sure the dead man stayed down. And so we have to ask why. Archaeologists believe the answer lies in fear. The Middle Ages were ravaged by famine and plague and disease. When death swept through a community, people sometimes looked to the graves for the cause. A corpse that decayed too slowly or looked too intact might be branded as dangerous. People who died of a disease that wasn't recognised could easily be considered to be something supernatural. And once the suspicion took hold, the body would be exhumed, cut apart, burned, just as the chronicles of Alnwick, Berwick, and Melrose describe. In Wharram Percy, those fears left scars not just on the imagination, but on the bones themselves. Proof that England's belief in vampires wasn't only written down in chronicles, it was acted upon violently in the very earth beneath our feet. So the next time you think of vampires, don't just picture Transylvania. Think of wind-swept castles in Northumberland, torchlight processions in monastery graveyards, and mutilated skeletons buried beneath English soil. To the people who lived then, these weren't fairy tales, they were lived terrors. Whether they were caused by disease, superstition, or something stranger, they left their mark in blood, ash, and bone. And this is only one part of the story. Because while England had its revenants, Europe had its own vampires. Figures like Arnold Paulé, whose exhumation would shock the continent and inspire the legends we know today. And across the Atlantic, America faced its own vampire panic in the 19th century, where disease and fear again drove people to dig up their dead. I'll be covering these fascinating stories in future episodes, so be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss them. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I love reading them. We also have membership turned on now for those of you who would like to support the channel, and it's much appreciated. I'll see you next time.